Okay, good morning. Okay, so I'm supposed to give a more formal introduction since we're recording it. I'm Gary Matsuoka at Laguna Hills Nursery, and this morning we're going to be talking about a lot of things to do with pruning plants. So the first thing we'll go over is what pruning does to plants. Now, the one thing to know on plants is that pruning never makes them stronger. So a lot of people think, well, if the plant's in trouble, prune it back. Well, whenever you prune a plant, it does open up a wound, and the plant has to close that wound. So it's going to take some energy to do that. So be aware of that. If you don't prune into any living tissue, like you just prune off something that's totally dead, it's not a big issue. But if you cut into the living part of a plant, it will have to spend some energy to close the wound. Now, plants, unlike us, I mean, when you get a wound, your body will heal the wound and make it like it was brand new, and sometimes even better than brand new, make it a little thicker than it was previously. But plants don't do anything like that. So if you were to cut a plant, say this is a branch on a plant, and you cut it across, the plant doesn't usually seal right where you cut it. So most plants uh, generally backtrack a little bit and seal quarter inch, half inch, or even inch behind. They have a automatic sealing mechanism inside their wood. So even if they're dormant in the wintertime, it still operates. It creates a sugar barrier with sugar molecules. They make a nice strong barrier, but they don't make it right at the wounded area. So this area closer to the wound is allowed to decay a little bit or dry up or whatnot. So the plant backtracks a little bit. Some plants are better at this. Some plants are not so good at healing or sealing their wounds. We call it sealing the wound. So among plants that have been studied, it's interesting. The one that seals their wounds the best, that is, seals them closest to the cut area, apple trees. They've studied apple trees and said, boy, they seal their wounds really nice. The worst ones they know of, or the worst tree they know of, is a peach tree, which is interesting. They're related, but peaches are the worst. So if you were to cut a peach tree, at that point you may get no sealing at all throughout the stem or way far down. It finally seals up. So, and in general too, how well they seal determines how long the plant lives. So peach orchards, because of all the pruning we do on them, we're talking, they say now 13 years is how long they usually have a peach orchard operation. Used to be 25, but now they said, past 10 years, they're so damaged by the pruning that they're going downhill already. So by the 13th year, economically, it makes sense to do something else. Whereas apple orchards, productive well over 100 years, 150 years, they can keep those going because they don't suffer much from the pruning we do to them, relatively. So, and the other thing that happens if you were to make a wound, say on the side of a branch, then they also have to seal that wound. So now what happened a long time ago, before they had good equipment, actually the Forest Department says it was, when they studied trees, it was the invention of the chainsaw that made a huge difference, because it made it easier for them to go out in the forest and just cut a tree down and examine what was going on. But in the old days, when they cut off branches, they would do in fact, up until about 1985, they told us a flush cut. So if you cut off a side branch, you cut that thing as close as you can to the trunk. Because what would happen, the closer you cut it, the faster the bark would grow back over the area. But now they don't do that. Well, they found out that when they do a flush cut, you damage the wood inside up and down, below and beyond the wound. So they don't do that close anymore. So now the proper way of cutting off a branch. So let's draw a branch in detail as it attaches to the trunk here. So on a tree, well, let's go back a little bit. So on a tree, if you do a cross section of a tree, there's a layer that you have to know about. That's called the cambium layer. Underneath the bark is a cambium layer. And this is where actually the plant cells are dividing. The cambium layer expands as the tree grows. What it does is it creates wood cells to the inside of it and bark cells to the outside of it. And that's the area of the tree that's actually growing. This is making wood toward the inside, bark toward the outside. The wood is called the xylem. And generally, in the xylem tissue, the water from the roots goes up to the leaves. And then the phloem, which is the bark, that is the transport system from the leaves back down to the roots. And it's divided by the cambium layer. So this is pushing outwards. The phloem is pushing outwards like that. And as a tree grows, in many trees, the phloem, it's created when the tree is smaller, and as the tree grows bigger, it can't stretch anymore. So that's why it starts cracking. So in a lot of trees, you get cracked bark because the phloem can't stretch anymore. So it creates these big fissures as it grows, because this was created, the outer part of that bark was created when the tree was skinnier, and as it grows, it just cracks it apart. And that makes the cracked bark, like on cork trees or stuff like that. Now on some trees, it just splits off. So on a lot of eucalyptus, it just peels right off every year. It can't stretch, so it peels off, and you get a smooth trunk. There are some trees where it seems to grow. I mean, you look at a ficus tree and go, that's smooth. I don't see anything peeling. It must be growing. I don't know how ficus trees work, but on most trees, it's either cracking and making a deep fissured bark, or it's peeling off.
Does that open itself to disease or anything, like in your fruit trees, or is it okay?
Well, there are some instances where bugs can get in there. It's a good hiding place too, but in general, no. That's how it's made to work. So I think a lot of the plants that have that fissure bark, they have a lot of tannins in this bark, which are very irritating to insects. So that it keeps, like redwood bark full of tannins, cedar bark full of tannins, and bugs don't like that at all. So they probably do that for a reason, to keep the bugs from getting into the wood. So anyway, this is the part that's growing. The bark from the branches and the bark from the trees collide, because a branch acts like a different animal. It seems like it's not really a part of the trunk. So when the branch comes off, it has its own bark. So on this little thing here, this is a branch from an orange tree. You may or may not be able to see this, but there's a line here. It's called the branch bark ridge. So this was the main trunk, this is a side branch, all this is just almost as big. But the bark that's forming between them is being pushed up into a crease. And they call that the branch bark ridge. See it on both sides. But all trees have this same architecture. So that's this line right here is the branch bark ridge, BBR. So all this on this side is the bark from the branch. On this side, it's the bark from the main trunk of the tree. And inside, what's going on is the wood from this branch is going like this. And the wood from the trunk is going like this underneath there. They kind of intertwine in there, the wood of the branch and the wood of the trunk, but generally it stays below this bark branch ridge. So if you're cutting off this side branch here, if you want to avoid damaging any of the wood of the tree, then they say you make a line parallel to the trunk right where the bark branch ridge is. And you see this angle between here and here? They say take the same angle out this way and cut it right there so that you miss, I didn't draw this perfect, but the wood from this tree can come out a little further. But if you draw a line perpendicular or parallel to the trunk and then go the same angle from the bark branch ridge out the other direction, you cut right there and you miss the wood of the tree. So you don't damage this part of the tree. You cut off this branch entirely. Now if you cut it right here real close, there's nothing left of the branch sticking out, so it can't regrow. If you leave a little stub, you'll miss the tree, but this will probably regrow if there's anything sticking out. Now if you want to do the other thing and cut off this tree and leave this branch, you cut right along that branch bark ridge. That line right there, you'll miss all the wood to that branch and take off the main trunk.
And that's regardless of the thickness or the circumference of whatever tree you're considering?
True. I mean, if you want to top a tree, you cut it down to a side branch that's already established. And what happens here, if there's no wood from this branch, the main trunk sticking out, it won't resprout. This has control now of that top of that tree. So the other thing to know is that on a plant, there is controlled by hormones. So plants are controlled by hormones that they make. The hormones are made in two places. The very growing tip of each branch, where all the cells are forming, is creating hormones. They call them, I don't know, they just invented a name for it. It's called auxin. But there's a lot of different hormones that are in that category of auxin. So vitamin B1, which you may have heard about, naphthalcetic acid is one form of auxin that plants make. So they're making auxin at each growing point, and each leaf also produces some auxin. And that is fed, and by gravity it goes downwards through this trunk. And what the auxin does in high concentrations, it inhibits any of the side buds growing. Now on any plant, I'm going to go back here. So on any branch where you have a leaf attached, and this one just happens to be an alternate leaf attachment where a leaf is on this side, then on this side, then this side, this side. Here's a plant where the leaves are attached in pairs or opposite each other, two at the same point. This one's opposite. Some plants are in whorls where there's a whole bunch of leaves in a circle around the branch. But anyway, wherever a branch is attached, there is a potential, or a leaf is attached, there is a potential bud right at the base of that, on top of it, right at the base on top of each leaf where a new branch can grow. Occasionally the plant doesn't make one, but typically all plants have a little bud right at the top of the leaf that can sprout and grow. Now, it's not just one. If you take a picture of it and say, here's where the leaf is attached, there's usually one main bud that can sprout out, but just in case that one fails, the plant has backups around where the leaf is attached. So in case one fails, it can send out another branch. I don't know how many they have, but there are buds there. So if now the auxin that's coming down this branch and coming down the leaf prevents this bud from opening up. And if it's real dominant, apically dominant, like this branch is here, this is got so much auxin coming down, there's no side branches at all. On this plant, it's not so dominant because it's branching right. So this is already branched out. Just one leaf past the top, it's already branching out sideways. So this is how, this is plants that want to be a bush do that. They're not very dominant on the hormones coming down. The side buds take over and start growing right away. Whereas on this fig tree, you see this real long stem with no side branching at all. Now the only way to make this thing side branch is to get rid of the tip. So if you prune this tip off, then like what we did with this last year, this tree was about 7 foot tall, no branching. So we just cut it off. When you cut off that tip, then usually at least 1 or 2 or sometimes more of the buds that are left without any auxin coming down, then they start growing. So you get this 2 branches. I would say usually it's 3 or 4, but this thing must be really dominant. So when this one came out and this one came out, nothing else is growing. Some plants aren't that powerful. You take off the top and the next 4 buds start growing. This one is just like one's taken over again. So I'll cut it, cut that thing again and again to make it to branch out better. Now it is gravity operated. So one other way that plants start branching, if this branch gets so long and heavy that it does this, and suddenly the tip drops below horizontal, then this area of the branch, there's not enough auxin to prevent, it'll start growing right here. So you can bend branches over and do the same thing as you can by tipping them off. So in nature, a lot of trees create a crown when they'll grow straight up, single trunk, way high, and then eventually they can't do it anymore, and they just bend over either the wind or something, and then they get more branches coming out, and then they create a head that way.
What if it's bending because it's loaded with fruit?
Does the same thing.
Just let it happen?
Well, yeah. The other thing that happens with branches, so once a branch bends down below horizontal, a lot of times they stop growing this way. This bud says, well, we're not pointing in the right direction, we stop. And then they just grow these out. So that happens a lot in trees too, or plants in general. If the branch is facing the wrong direction, it stops growing. Some keep on going, like vines can keep on going. But a lot of plants, yeah, you bend that thing over and it stops. Okay, so that's kind of the basics, and what I'll do next is talk about what are the strongest forms we want trees. Now, when we talk about fruit tree, that's totally different, but when you talk about shade trees, there's a few forms that are the strongest. So one of the things you want to avoid on trees is having branches that are, especially if you have a trunk and you have a side branch come up real close like this, this branch going straight up. What happens, the problem with that is that, like on this one here, this branch was so parallel to the trunk, instead of forming a bark branch ridge, it's swallowing the bark inside here. It's too narrow. So they call that included bark. The bark is it's forming a fold between this and this. The problem with that is if this is a real big tree and you got a lot of weight on here, this is not attached to this. And there's potential breaking off. Now, the Forest Department used to think that this was terrible, 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 but they noticed that there's a lot of big pine trees in the forest with double trunks. And each trunk is so big that there's no way they're going to fall over. So now they're saying, well, just watch this folded in bark branch ridge, and if it starts to move toward one edge, then you know that trunk is going to fail. If it goes straight between them, it's probably strong enough if there's enough trunk there. But if it starts to go off to one side, then this branch is going to break off, so get rid of it. So they're finding things out that, so the two trunks going straight up parallel may not be the worst thing in the world, although it's certainly not something they'd promote on trees because they can't form any bark or wood when they're that close together. It's the weak area of the tree if there's two branches really, really close together. I mean, on a fruit tree, if a branch breaks off and fails, no one's going to get killed. But if you have a 100-foot eucalyptus, yeah, this can be a definite problem. So be aware of that. You don't want branches that are real close together like this. So on most shade trees, what they feel is the strongest structure is a single trunk, relatively straight up. Doesn't have to be perfect, but relatively straight up, and branches coming off, but not too horizontal. It's roughly between, you want the branch to be between 30 degrees above horizontal to about 30 degrees less than vertical. So this is the zone where you want that branch to grow. What happens if it's too horizontal, then it starts making these shoots that come up like this and try to become trunks. So you don't want it to be too horizontal because it starts sprouting on you. Now some trees do it anyway and it doesn't bother them. I mean, it doesn't cause trouble. Like you see some of those huge oak trees, especially in the deep south. You see these huge oak trees. The branches go 100 foot that way. They're not sprouting anything vertical. They're just going sideways. And you don't want it closer than 30 degrees because then it's going to compete with the trunk. So that's it's actually like 27 degrees, but so this is 90 degrees between vertical and horizontal, and you want it somewhere in between that. And generally they don't want the branches too close together. So on trees, if you've got a branch here and then a branch right next to it like this going out, and you have like say, if you have like they say walnut trees, they want them to be real strong. Well, their branches get about 18 inches in diameter. But if you got branching on your tree that's closer than that together, there's no room for the two branches. So they space them out. Now, all this stuff you don't have to do when the tree's young. You just watch it as it grows. It's like here's a ginkgo tree. Now, if this was a walnut tree, then this branch and this branch are way too close together. They want it to be 18 inches apart anywhere on the trunk, 18 inches on this side before you get to a branch say on this side. But at a young age, you want the tree to have a lot of foliage, so you don't worry about it when it's young. You just watch it as it grows, and as the branches get thicker, you start making sure that they're getting cut off. A lot of times what we'll do is make sure that the branch doesn't outgrow. Well, one of the other things they do, if the branch is larger than 1/3 of the diameter of the trunk, get rid of it or cut it short. You don't want any competition with that main trunk on a shade tree, an ornamental shade tree. So if this branch is coming out too thick, and it's not, But if it comes out really thick, say close to half the diameter of the regular trunk, it's too strong. And you either cut it off or you cut it real short so it has to regrow. And supposedly the strongest pattern on a tree is to have the branching come off in a spiral pattern up the trunk. And I forgot what they call it. I'm pretty sure it's called a delayed vase.
That for fruit trees as well?
No. Well, this is for strength. So for a shade tree in particular, if you want your tree to be, a eucalyptus or a big oak tree or anything like that, that you want to grow 60 foot tall and you don't want it to break in the future, then this is what you would do. So you'd have, say, a branch, and most shade trees, you figure, okay, the first permanent branch is probably going to be about 5 foot, 6 foot off the ground. All the low stuff is going to be in the way if that tree gets big. So let's say at 5 foot, you have a branch over here going this direction. And if, say, it's a big oak tree, say, okay, the trunk, the side branch is going to get a foot in diameter. So a foot up the tree, you can go another branch coming straight forward at you, and then another foot up the trunk, another branch going that direction, a foot up the trunk, another branch going toward the back. So it's kind of the ideal shape is a spiral going up the trunk. And it's called a delayed vase.
12 inches instead of 18?
Depends on the tree. So if it depends how thick the branches are supposed to get. Like in walnuts, the branches get 18 inches in diameter. You don't want them any closer than 18 inches. Depends on the tree, or how long you expect to live there with the tree. You go, well, the tree's I'm going to be around 20 more years, so it doesn't matter to me at all. But now the other shape that trees take is a true vase, which is what this tree is trying to do. Let me get this one out of the way. Thank you. So on this tree, it was very apical dominant. We clipped it here, and now it's just going this way. So the shape you want this tree to take, although it may not do it on itself, is to go this way, where you have one trunk, then you have two, then you have four, and then you have 8. So each one keeps dividing in 2.
Is that what it wants to do, or what you want?
What we want it to do. Because a lot of the small trees, that's what you want them to do. You don't want a straight trunk on them. You want an umbrella head. And to get that, we go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. And you want to space this so there's some room for the branching, not too close together. You see some trees in the landscape that no one's been watching, and they go from one trunk to like 6 or 8 branches, right within a few inches of each other, all right here. What happens about 15 years down the road is these things are so close together, they all start splitting off. There's no room for these to grow, so they all kind of split off each other. And you end with the messed up looking tree because all the branches here are splitting. So you want to make sure that you've got some room between the branch points. Whether it be a couple inches or a foot. 2 foot looks pretty nice in a lot of small trees. Cut it. It may do a lot of this, but keep trimming them off as the tree grows and make sure the next branch point that's permanent is about 2 foot up and then 2 foot up till you get to a nice tree with, say, 20 upright branches. So that's a true vase. And a lot of small trees do that real well. Redbuds, maples. One of the problems we have with maple trees is they have the setup where the leaves are alternate, like opposite. And what happens is when they grow new branches, they tend to grow a branch like this. So you're starting with one branch, you've got now 3 of them. and that's not the strongest shape in nature. 1 to 2 is. So on maples, a lot what we do is go back and say, okay, which 2 do I want to keep? Let's cut out one of them, the center one, the side one. Instead of having 3 at one point, have 2. The 2 looks better than 3. They call this bifurcation rather than going to 3. So with maples, we go back through them now and then and just take a look, say, okay, I don't want the center one here, or I don't want this side one here. And it's turned out over the years that what's aesthetically pleasing is usually also the strongest structure. Now, a lot of conifers, and ginkgos are in the conifer family, naturally do what is called whorls of branches. So they'll have a whole bunch of branches starting. You know, anyone who's who's worked with Christmas trees knows how pine trees grow. They have a straight trunk, and then at one spot they'll have 5 branches go off in all directions, like a star. And then another foot up, they'll do the same thing. They do that. So that's normal for them. So we usually just allow that to go on, because it seems on, if you've ever pruned Christmas trees, you'll notice that whenever they have a whorl of branches, the tree is much wider there. It's like it all comes out, so there's room for all these branches, and then they get skinny again. And the next whorl, everything's wide again, where the branches are attaching, so there's a lot of room for these branches. So on cedars, pines, a lot of those trees, that's an acceptable form of branching. They just leave them alone. But even on old, if you look at an old cedar tree, you don't see this anymore. You see like one branch at each point survived over time, like 50 years down the road, all the other branches fall off and you have one left or die off. So the older pines and cedars still only have one branch at each level, but usually we leave them alone. They seem to be very strong with that structure that they make. Okay, so that's the strongest ways to shape trees up. Thank you. So now with fruit trees, one other thing, timing. So in the old days, especially the people in the temperate climates, like Germany did a lot of work with trees back in the 1800s. They figured that it's best to prune trees in the middle of winter because they don't bleed. They thought there's something wrong with when plants bleed. It turns out that probably the best time to prune trees is when they're awake, because the bleeding is what keeps the bugs out of the wood. That's the natural reaction. It seals the wood. It keeps the bugs from getting into the cut areas. Especially in Southern California, since we're so warm in the winter and we still have a lot of bugs out when those trees are dormant, no sap flow. But in general, we say, okay, winter's okay. But summer is a real good time to prune trees. The only time is not a good time is right when they put out their flush of spring growth. It's right when they're pushing their growth out. So the plants store their energy in the wood. So they have a lot, during the fall, they usually store energy inside the wood in the form of carbohydrates. And in spring, they use them all to push out new growth. So they get low in carbohydrates right when they start growing their new leaves. And it takes them a while, a couple months after their leaves are pushed out, then they've got recovered that energy, and then it's safe for them again to be stressed by pruning it, and they can close those wounds up. But if they're growing real fast at that moment and you prune them, it's hard for them to seal that wound, and you might get a lot of dieback, severe dieback when you prune it. So spring is the worst time, but spring on some plants is winter. Some plants wake up really early, and some plants wake up really late. So just be aware that you give them about a month or two after their leaves come out. before you do much major pruning. But summer is a good time to prune. Now the thing about summer pruning, so plants are programmed to grow spring and summer. Most temperate climate plants especially grow spring and summer. So you prune them in spring or summer, they will just continue growing and they'll do what you want them to do. Once we get to fall, when suddenly the nights get longer than the days, a lot of the temperate climate plants will not grow after that. So be aware of that. You prune them at that time, they're not going to grow anymore. It doesn't hurt them to prune them at that time, but you may not get what you want back. A lot of the tropicals will grow right into winter because they don't know any better. But a lot of evergreen things. But plants from the northern climates or from the northern or the temperate zones, they are usually meant to shut down and stop growing by fall. So.
Is there an amendment that you could give to the tree or plant if, let's say, you do an excessive amount of pruning, whatever that means, and then it stunts the progress? Can you give something to the plant to kind of kick that off and help it?
Yeah, it's a side thing, but yes. They use sugar to do all their things, and the leaves make sugar. We found out that if they have any green parts on them, they'll absorb sugar. So if you're doing a lot of pruning, you can spray what's left with sugar and water on the green parts, and they'll absorb it. So, Caro syrup, molasses. Molasses was the original formula we saw. They made that formula because they were taking cuttings and wanting them to root, and they found out they couldn't finish rooting because the cutting ran out of sugar. So they made a sugar solution out of molasses, sprayed it on the leaves of their cuttings, and they finished rooting. So if you want your plant to do anything faster, you can spray sugar on it. We talk about that a lot because it's fun to do. You can get plants to do unusual things if you supplement their sunlight. They store the energy of sunlight as sugar. Sugar molecule is created to store the energy of sunlight. Well, you spray sugar on them, they just grow faster, get bigger, heal wounds better, all that stuff. Make more fruit, make more flowers, make sweeter fruit. Anyway, that's kind of fun to do. So pruning fruit trees, there's a couple things they found out lately that make a huge difference for us. So one of the main things they found out in the last 20 years is that the most productive size and shape of a fruit tree is about 5 foot wide and a dome shape. So in the old days, you should shape trees like this. 20 foot across, open center, so the sunlight can get in this way. Now they found that the most, it makes sense. The most efficient form to gather light is a dome, and it's a dome that's no more than 5 feet wide because the sunlight can get through more than about 3 foot of leaves. 2.5 foot of leaves, no more sun. So if you've got a tree, let's say 20 foot across, you just have a shell of fruit being grown like this, and the inside here is non-productive. So they found out if they load up, the space of one 20 foot wide tree, you can have, say, 8 or 9 5 foot trees. These will be more productive than the one big one. So now the goal is to keep them smaller. Now, for homeowners, this is also good because when you have, say, a plum tree that's 20 foot wide, that's like 500 fruit. You got 2 weeks to eat it. It's like, well, I mean, I've had 20 foot, big plum trees and good crop, and you go, what do we do with all this stuff? It's just a waste. But if you have a 5 foot wide tree, that's less than 100 fruit. So much more manageable for a homeowner. Orchards, they just do it because you get more fruit per square foot that way. And for a homeowner now, the same thing. You get more fruit per square foot, and now you can have, instead of one type of peach that ripens, say, in 2 weeks, you can have, say, 8 different peach trees that ripen all at different times. Some peaches ripen in April, some in May, some in June, some in July, some into August. So you can have all these different ripening periods and just have your pick of when you want to eat the fruit. So it's, for us now, it's a lot better. Now the problem is the plants naturally want to get bigger, so you have to prune more. In orchards, they have special rootstocks that prevent them getting big, although with peaches, there isn't any. Apples, they do have them, special rootstocks that keep the trees from growing that big. We don't use them down here because they warned us it's only meant for areas up north where they get a heck of a lot of rain. Plus, they always have to be on a stake. They won't stand up by themselves on that rootstock. So we tend to go with the ones that the trees can grow bigger. You just up to you to prune them. Now, a lot of trees, when they're young, it's like you go out every couple months and prune them, or even every month and prune them to keep them that size. But we've noticed that as the trees age, you prune less and less to keep them that same size. So.
Is it that they get used to the structure you want them to take? Or the shape, I mean?
I don't think they have a brain, so I don't know.
Like if you just keep pruning.
Well, as plants get older, they just get less vigorous, and it might have more to do with the root system than with the top of the tree.
Oh, I see.
Sounds like humans.
Right.
I have an Alberta peach that's like 15 years old and it's loaded, it's beautiful every year, I just love it. But it's cut like that, it's wide, it's probably about 10, 12 feet tall. And it's cut really wide and big, so can you change them into the dome slowly or not?
Well, you kill it.
All, but
No, once they're past, say, 5 years old, if you trim it heavily, you'll probably kill it, because peaches don't put up with the wounding too well. So on any plant, the younger the branch you cut, the smaller the wound and the less damage you do. And as the tree gets older, then everything gets bigger. So you cut a branch that's a foot wide, you got a huge wound there. You cut a branch that's a 1/4 inch wide, you hardly have any wound there. So it's better to do all the shaping and stuff when the plant's as young as possible. Although on an apple tree, you can cut those things down and start over again. And they do that same with avocado trees. When they get big, they just saw them down, let them regrow. But on some trees,
for Alberta peaches to be pruned back,
best month
yeah,
probably summer.
right after.
Right after the fruit's off, then you can prune it. So yeah, still good.
Right after that.
So on peach trees, even though they train them differently now, it's the same theme. On peach trees, what they notice, and a lot of fruit trees, whatever grows vertical won't fruit. Whatever goes horizontal fruits really well. So they want few vertical trunk stems, lots of horizontal. Now in the old days when they did this, so what they would do is, to make that wide thing, is they'd cut it off. They make the first cut at knee height, and then get 2 trunks, and then a year later they'd cut it off a few inches higher, and then the next year they'd cut it a few inches higher and get 16 trunks going vertical. So here you have a tree with 16 verticals, and then everything else on it you want to be horizontal. Well, it took 5 years to get the structure down, or 6 years to get 16? 2, 4, 8, yeah, 16 verticals. And the tree's almost halfway through with its productive life. So now they said, well, let's not do that anymore. It took half the tree's life to make it to shape we want. So most of the farms now in California have gone to just 2 trunks. Or in our case, we're just telling people go with 1. Because that's a lot of fruit on 1 trunk. The 1 vertical and make everything go horizontal. The problem with this is that it's almost too vigorous with just 1 trunk. The branches really take off and go on you. Whereas they say with 2 trunks competing, the side growth isn't so vigorous. But we can't do the two trunk thing in our nursery because it's just too much room. You have, because they want this to be a U, to be strong. They want, and to get these apart, they want it to be a nice U to go out like this, and then go straight up. Well, we don't have room to do that now. In Canada, because their growing season's so short, they just say they work with one stem going straight up. And we say for simplicity, do that. You may have to cut these back a little bit because they'll want to shoot out real far to the side because there's only one trunk. But that's essentially what we're going for simplicity and to knock the production down a bit too. So here we've looked at, now on this tree, you got one, here's a problem branch here. This one's competing with that main trunk. So when they go like this and start going upwards, you want to just pull them down. Literally just pulling this branch down will stop it from growing too far out and make it non-competitive with that trunk. And then the sunlight can hit all these leaves and make flower buds. Here, see when the branches are going straight up, these leaves aren't getting enough sunlight, so they can't make good flower buds. But when they're out like this and exposed to more sunlight, then they're stronger and they make flower buds all on this branch.
Would you tie the limb?
You might, yeah. For a while they said hang weights from it, and then they realized it's too dangerous to hang weights from your branch. Get hit in the head with them. So they said tie them down.
Is that what happens? A lot of folks I see, they'll train, I don't even know what types of plants to start going off if it's on a trellis, or they just want to shape it a certain way, and it supposedly grows more fruit that way?
Yeah. So there are things they make called branch spreaders. They're little wedges that you can put between the trunk and this branch that'll hold it out at this angle, or you just tie it either to the trunk down here or to a branch below it, say. Now on peaches, generally the branches on a structure, this style of doing it, you only want the branch to be alive for 1 year plus fruiting the next year, and then you cut it off. Unless you want your tree to grow bigger. So almost all fruit trees, peaches included, whatever branch grows leaves this year will make flower buds where the leaves were. Now, so next year you'll have flower buds here and fruit forming here, but this branch will go another 2 foot longer, and that's going to mess up your shape. Your tree now, instead of being 5 foot wide, now suddenly your tree is 8 foot wide, and if you keep keeping that branch, then it's got to grow longer and longer every year to get fruit again. So we don't want this branch for more than the year it fruits. You clip it off, but you don't clip it totally off. What they say is clip it after it fruits, you clip it short. And hopefully it'll regrow a branch right where this one was. You can wait till winter. So this one is fruiting, it's growing a little further, and next winter you come back and you say, this branch fruited, I'm going to cut it short. And then another branch here, you say, okay, this branch didn't fruit this year, it grew, so I'm going to leave this branch in its place. So you're just switching branches, trying to maintain the same shape of this tree, but these branches are not permanent, they're temporary. You cut them short after they fruit, and then they can regrow the following year, and then hopefully that year, then you'll keep that branch, it'll fruit, then you cut it short after that year again. And you keep trading branches, and they want to be about 1 foot apart up and down the trunk, and you can say I work with 4 sides of this tree, so there's a branch every foot on 4 sides, or you can say, okay, there's actually 6 sides on this tree. You can do whatever you want. Say there's 6 sides, so you say, oh, branch here, branch here, branch here, branch here, branch here, branch here, all different sides of the tree, and you work with it that way. It's not going to be perfect, but that's your goal, is to have new branches coming out about, if this branch stops at this length, this is perfect, about 2 foot long. What the universities found out is that branches that grow between 1 and 2 feet make the best quality fruit. If they're too short, fruit's no good. Now, I would tell you, because we're in Southern California and the growing season here is so long, I don't expect this branch to stop at 2 feet. It's probably going to be 4 foot long. But if you still have these leaves here, just cut it back to 2 foot long. Because as long as these leaves are still here, they'll still make the flower buds right here. You don't want a tree that's suddenly 8 foot across, but that's what it can do because their growing season's so long here. These things can really just go. But just keep clipping them. As long as these leaves are still here, they'll still make the flower buds there, and this will be a fruiting branch next year. And generally with orchards, they don't let them go any higher than 10 feet because they can't reach anything. And for homeowners, say, you know, this, I can reach 7 foot, and that's it. So just cut off anything above where you can reach so that you don't have to climb ladders.
So my old peach tree, how do I contain it, run it back? How much can you bring back?
How old is it?
Close to 50 years.
Yeah, so it's past its prime. So just go with what it's doing and then just replace it and put something else in later on.
It's just so prolific every year. I mean,
Well, if it makes enough for you and you don't need, you know, because your option is you can, instead of having 1 peach tree there, you can have 8 peach trees making more fruit at different times. That's your option. Now, the one thing about fruit trees or any plant really is you can't plant the same thing in the same spot twice. You can if you replace the dirt where you put the next tree in, but if you take out a peach tree and put an apple tree in, there's no problems at all. Take out a peach tree and put a new peach tree in, all it sees around it is dead peach roots, and it stunts the growth on it severely for 10 years. So you don't want to do that. Now you can take out the dirt, so we know that you can replace the soil 3 foot wide, 1.5 foot deep with soil from either a distant part of the yard or just brand new fresh dirt or sand, and then put the same tree in there and it'll do fine. They do that in orchards. Or if they have an old peach orchard, they'll just pull it out, put in something totally different. Apples, pears, any stone fruit is going to be stunted by the fact that you had peach roots there, because peaches trees are usually growing on, well, they're usually growing on peach roots, but then so are apricots and plums are often grown on peach roots too. So, okay, so that's peach trees. Kind of thin them out. Get your branch structure nice and horizontal with the one vertical trunk. Now apples are different because on apple trees, same structure. Now the only bad thing about pruning them severely every winter is that you don't get any spring crop. So the spring crop, so as they grow figs on each leaf, at the very end of the branch, as we get down to December, the figs don't develop. They just stay little buds on the branch, and then those develop the next spring when the tree wakes up again, and that's your spring crop. It's just the figs that didn't develop last fall because it was too late in the year. So if you cut all your branches back in winter, you don't get a spring crop. Now most fig trees, when they're older, they have a lot of little short branches that you just leave there, and that's your spring crop. The long branches, cut them back. Some fig trees don't grow very far. You don't have to cut them at all. Like panache fig might grow 6 or 8 foot in its lifetime. It doesn't get that tall. So then you don't have to prune it. Unfortunately, panache, the tiger fig, doesn't make any spring crop anyway. So that's figs. There's a couple other trees. Well, there's 2 fruit trees that produce on new wood, so you don't really have to care about what you cut off, but only a couple. So jujubes are one. I forgot to bring one in here, but jujube tree fruits totally on new wood. So in areas of the world where they come from, the southern Asia, they said they use the whole tree. So the farmers, they say around August, September, they harvest about 20 pounds of jujube fruit off the tree. And they said 2 weeks later, they strip all the leaves off. Now, truthfully, the leaves are going to fall off about 2 or 3 weeks after the crop's off. They start shedding their leaves in the fall anyway, but they pick all the leaves off and feed them to their cattle. And then when the tree's dormant in the winter, they just cut it down to a stump and then sell the wood as firewood. So they start with the stump every year, and it grows back and it makes fruit. So I decided, boy, I got to see if this really works. So I had an 8-foot jujube in my backyard, well, actually more like 10 foot. Cut it down. Now they usually cut it down to 4 foot, which gives them a big, strong trunk. Well, I cut mine down to 18 inches. I want to see, I made sure I was above the graft, but I wanted to get it real short to see what would happen. And by July of that year, the tree was up to my face and flowering again. And it looked prettier than it did previously. So jujubes, you cut them hard, it keeps them small, they still produce. So no issues with that tree. Pomegranate's the same, although you don't want to waste too much of their, again, their strong branches, because the thicker the branches are, the more strength they have to make the crop. So don't cut them back too hard, but they fruit on new wood too. So.
What about ones like avocado for trimming and pruning and growth during the
Well, like most evergreen fruit trees, avocado, citrus, as long as you have leaves on the tree when you're pruning it, they can still flower from the wood developing off where the leaves were. Now, avocados, the way they used to do them, a long time ago, they don't do this anymore, but what they would do is let them grow too high to pick, like 20, 25 foot, and then they would just chainsaw them down to 4 foot. And they wouldn't fruit for 1 year, but they'd grow back like 6 foot that year, and then flower the next year and have another crop the following year. And I've done that. I've tried it. The first year of the drought, or second year of the drought, 2014, because we had heard that a lot of the farms in San Diego weren't getting any water that year, 2013. They didn't have any water. So to save their avocado trees, they just topped them all, cut them down to stumps. They don't use any water for about 4 months. They just stay a stump. But by summer, they sprout out and then get going. And then, mine started around June, and by December was about 6 foot of growth back on it. And then it flowered the next year. So that's what they did to save water for that year. So avocado trees can do that. Citrus, I think they've done it, but citrus now, they just hedge them. As long as you're cutting and, as long as you don't cut past the last leaf on that branch, then it can still flower the next year. But I see them in the summertime with these trucks just driving through the orchard. They have saws on the sides. They're just hedging those trees. One of our customers' ancestor, she said her uncle, her great uncle, I think it was her great uncle, invented that, the truck with the saws on it to go through the orchards. And he made so much money making those trucks with the saws on them, then they bought Rancho Mission Viejo and started Mission Viejo Company. So she's one of the heirs to the Mission Viejo Company. But they said they got their wealth because they invented the truck with the saws on it. So they just bevel the trees. So in the citrus orchards, they're almost like hedges, but they make sure they're beveled. So in cross section, they're like this, and they cut them essentially like that, so that the sun can hit it all. But it's much faster to do it with the truck than by hand. So, and it's some things that they don't do anymore. So in the old days, University of California has done a lot of these studies. They used to skirt the trees 3 feet off the ground. They thought that if the branches were hitting the ground, too many bugs and things would come up and damage the fruit, like snails. Disease would splash off the ground into the bottom foliage. But it cost them, about $2,000 an acre to do all this work. Well, they decided to not do this and see what happened, and they made more money by not skirting trees. But still, it looks better to skirt them. It's cleaner looking. But by not skirting them, they got more fruit to sell. Even though some of it was damaged, they still made more money per acre. And then the other thing that they would do is they would clean out all the dead branches inside the trees. Spend a couple thousand an acre to do that. They decided, let's not do that anymore and see what happens. Nothing happened. So now they don't spend the money to clean out the dead wood. They just leave it in there. What happens when you have dead branches and it's raining a lot, sometimes the water dripping off of dead branches there's fungus in these branches. Sometimes you get these streaks on the fruit, on the skin. They call them tear streaks. Happens more in Florida than California because we don't get enough rain here to cause this. But the fungus off of dead wood will infect the skin and make these little streak marks on the fruit. Makes the fruit unsellable to retail anyway. But wholesale juice factories will take them. Any other questions? I think we covered most of it.
How much of a tree can you prune without doing tremendous damage?
That's hard to say. I mean, if you could stump a tree, that's cutting an awful lot of it off. I think as long as the part that's left is really healthy and it's got a lot of energy in it, then you're fine. If you got a sick tree and you cut it back, you can kill it. So, yeah, it's hard. I mean, most books will tell you on a shade tree, don't cut off more than 20% at one time. But I think there's a lot of leeway there if the tree's healthy. I mean, like in my backyard, we just thinned out a pine tree, took off at least 90% of the foliage. 90% of the branches are gone, and we don't expect any problems with it. It's a healthy tree. So it's too healthy, just too massive. So we just cut it. So it's kind of a judgment call there. So. I was going to talk about pruning tools, but I don't know that it's that important. Well, I'll mention a few things. I don't really push the expensive tools like I used to. So I used to like the best pruner out there is supposed to be the Falco number 7. This is supposed to be the Rolls Royce of pruners. And if you ever use one, you'll see why. This handle rotates in your hand. So when you're doing this, it's like there's nothing there. It's really weird when you first start using this because you go, there's nothing in my hand. I don't feel anything because it rotates in your fingers. So you don't get any calluses on your fingers when you use this one. And I've used one for about 10 years, but what the problem with this is if you're not really clean, and I'm not, the rotating parts get clogged up with dirt. So you end up cleaning it out every week. You take it apart every week, clean it, oil it, do all that stuff. It's kind of a pain, but it is really nice. And the nice thing about the expensive pruners is they make the blades so that they hold their edge, but they don't shatter. It's like a lot of the cheaper pruners out there, real sharp blades, but the metal is also very brittle. So if you drop this thing, it just breaks. You drop it on pavement, it'll just break because the metal is too brittle. Whereas the real expensive ones, they hold their edge, they're real sharp, but they're also not brittle. Whereas like the Corona pruners are always known, they don't break, but you got to sharpen them a lot. But so Coronas, which were made in Corona, California originally, became well known because it's what all the grape growers used. So, you have a vineyard, you've got hundreds of these for your workers. So they had to make them so that they're foolproof and they don't break. You might have to sharpen them every few weeks, but they don't break. So Corona's got that reputation. They don't break. They're meant to last. Now, I used to use 1-inch pruners when I was real macho and young, but they're heavy. 3/4 inch is the hottest seller because it's not so heavy. But every time we try ordering it, they're always sold out because everybody buys a 3/4 inch. So that means you can open this wide enough to cut a 1-inch branch. The 3/4 inch opens wide enough for 3/4. There's a 1/2 inch one too. Now this is one for people who are lazy who don't want to carry around. So for the 1-inch, 2-inch branches, use loppers, which take 2 hands to operate. But it's a lot of work to carry this around. So Corona came up with their pruners that you can turn into loppers by doing this. So the side things release, and you can make little loppers out of them so that you can prune bigger branches. But they are a bit heavy. But if you don't want to carry loppers, then you can just put this in your holster and it's fine. So that was their latest invention, is pruners that turn into loppers.
How do you clean these in between uses? What do you use?
Well, generally it's sap that messes them up, and hot water. You just soak them in hot water for a few minutes and then just wipe them off. So that's general. I mean, I haven't pruned my pruners in a year. These are Japanese, which are hard to get now. But the Japanese pruners, you know, they make the whole thing out of one piece of metal. But the metal's quite nice, so I can go. I think I haven't sharpened these for 2 years now. They hold their edge pretty good. They're not, you know, perfect anymore, but they are well made. So, but.
Do you add bleach to the water?
No, but if you want to clean them, say if you're pruning a diseased tree. So in general, you know, a lot of stone fruit trees can have bacterial infections as well as apples and pears. So a lot of those trees, in commercially, they will have bleach out there. They'll wipe their pruners between trees if they don't know if anything's on it, because peaches can get this bacterial infection that totally messes them up. They stop producing. We've seen it. So if you see a tree that's not healthy, then make sure you clean your pruners with the bleach. They claim you can do it with a flame, but if you flame metal, then you can ruin the hardness of it. So
Use rubbing alcohol on them? Would that be
not quite as good as bleach. 10% bleach is supposed to be the best. Alcohol next best. Flame is fine, but it may ruin your pruner.
What's the best way to sharpen them?
Not that, I don't know, a lot of guys who sharpen their pruners just use metal files. You don't have to be that accurate. But on any blade, period, you know, the angle you want your metal to be pruned at is 27.5 degrees. Because if it's too sharp an angle, then it breaks the metal. And metal breaks off too easily. And if it's too dull, you know, you go like this, it's too dull. But they found that on knives and any sharp blade you want, it's like 27 degrees. 27 degrees is the magic number, I guess. 27-degree angle off of horizontal or off vertical. And that gives you the right sharpness and strongest blade. But same thing for kitchen knives. So. I mean, if you've got an avocado tree or a pear tree or an apple tree, this is a nice one to have. This is a cut and hold pruner. So if just out of your reach, you can prune it and it'll hold the stem. So you can prune an avocado right here and it'll hold it until you bring it down and drop it into a bucket or into the grass or something like that. So the cut and hold pruners are quite handy. I use mine an awful lot with fruit trees. It doesn't help with a peach. There's not enough stem to hold on to, but with the fruit that has stems on it, even a bunch of grapes that's hanging up real high, you can just cut it and hold.
Is it better to snip the, let's say, avocado than it would be to just kind of tear it off?
With avocado fruit, they say if you pull the stem out of the fruit, you can open up a hole that might rot before it ripens. So you're supposed to cut off a little piece of stem with the fruit. Yeah. Okay, I think we're done. And just in case you didn't know, we're closing today early. One of our employees getting married this afternoon. So.
That's great.
Let me ask you a question about this tree. This is my nectarine tree.
Mm-hmm.